Okay, so the topic today is developing quality online discussions. And Brian had an excellent comment. He's moved away from discussions because they don't always seem like they contribute to learning. So he's curious if there are some techniques for effective discussions. And I absolutely agree. I have been in some classes both as a teacher and as a student where online discussions were not done as well as they could be. And at best, it feels like busy work sometimes, both for the students and for the instructor, really. So that's part of what we want to talk about is, are there times when discussions are worth it, and how do you make them worth it? So I'm hoping we can at least start to answer that question a little bit. I'm not going to say that online discussions are appropriate for every class because I don't think they are, but I think that there are situations when they can be helpful. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So today's topic, here's kind of the three big parts that we're going to be covering. First, why should you consider using online discussions? We're just going to talk about that a little bit. And then the main part of this presentation is what makes a good online discussion. And then lastly, because this is always a question with online discussions, how do you manage the grading workload? Because grading and managing an online discussion takes more work than, like a multiple choice quiz that runs itself. So the question is, how do we make it manageable so that it's worth our time? So why might you want to consider online discussions? There's a few different reasons. One advantage, potentially, is it allows students to contribute to the content of the course. In other forms of assessment activities, it's sort of a one-on-one transfer of information. The student is showing their work to you and to you alone, and then you might be giving them a grade or some kind of feedback, and that's the end of the communication, that's the end of the sharing. Whereas with an online discussion, you're allowing students to share their understanding and their knowledge with each other. And sometimes that can be really helpful. Again, it depends on the course, depends on the subject matter, but that can be a big benefit to discussions. It allows students to provide a certain kind of peer feedback. So this is especially helpful if you're working on some kind of larger project, a research project or a presentation or some kind of creative project where it's helpful to hear from your peers, see what they are doing, how they are solving the same problem in a different way, commenting on each other's work, and hopefully creating better work because of it. A big one is just increasing social presence. Social presence is something we talk about a lot in e-learning because it's kind of one of the things that we are trying to help develop. But basically, it's the awareness of others. It's the realization that when you're taking an online class, you're interacting with other human beings. You're not just taking a correspondence class where you're filling out the worksheet and mailing it back in. There's interaction, there's communication, there's social presence of some kind, both with the instructor and with your classmates. And this is one that I don't think we think about very often, but I think it's worth noting that online discussions, if done well, can give marginalized students a space to voice their opinions and demonstrate understanding. So that could include minority students, that could include students in more marginal socioeconomic conditions, that can include English as a second language students who may not feel comfortable speaking out loud in class. It may just include shy kids, students on the autism spectrum. All kinds of students, for all kinds of reasons, are not always comfortable speaking up in a classroom. But if you are giving them a space to collect their thoughts, think through what they want to say, practice with themselves, write it down, make a draft, make some changes, sleep on it, and then share their opinion or their knowledge. then this gives them a space to do that. That's, for some students, a huge difference. I have had students in both face-to-face and online classes before, and sometimes you'll have a student that is silent in a face-to-face class. They will never say a word. If you ever call on them in class, they're like a deer on the highway. But if you put them in an online setting where they have that space to kind of collect their thoughts and type out their communication, sometimes they just blossom, you know, they open right up. And it's not necessarily just for online only courses. Yes, online discussions can be really important in an online class because you don't really have a lot of other opportunities for that social presence, because the written discussion is trying to emulate a good classroom discussion, but it's not necessarily just for an online only class. There can be cases where it makes sense to do this in a hybrid or in a face-to-face class that happens to also use Canvas. So those are just a few considerations of why you might want to do this in the first place. So then the question is, you know, how do you do it well? Because like I said, we've probably all in one way or another taken part in a really bad online discussion. From the student point of view, there's nothing worse than a discussion that feels like busy work. And from an instructor point of view, there's nothing more demoralizing than a discussion where every student's post is just, well, Caleb, that's a good point. I absolutely agree with you. Or, oh, I really like how you said that thing that is super obvious, you know? So here's kind of a framework that I found that I really like. It's from this gal, Debbie Morrison. She has an online website called Online Learning Insights. It's a few years old, but the content's really good. And she kind of has this framework for the components of an effective online discussion. So first, a well-designed course and instructional plan, and we'll break down all these in just a minute. Clear, concise, transparent guidelines and expectations. Well-constructed topics and questions. A skilled facilitator or moderator, and an efficient assessment strategy for giving student feedback. Those are kind of, this is just a mental framework that is really helpful to me when I'm building a good online discussion. So what do each of those things really look like? So for a well-designed course, a well-designed instructional plan, if you're going to use online discussions, you need to be very intentional about how that aligns with your course objectives. Because this is where we get into the danger of busy work, right? Don't just have discussions as a thing to do. You should use discussions because they are the best way or a good way to meet your course objectives. I think it's important to emphasize transparency in e-learning, and in Angela Rasmussen's TLC, we talk about TILT a lot, transparency in learning and teaching. And a big part, and I'm not going to go way into TILT because that's its own topic, and hopefully we'll do that again sometime in the near future. But what that means for this is you should clearly communicate to students for all activities and all course components, but you should be able to communicate the purpose, meaning why are we doing this? The task, what are we doing? And the criteria, how are you being assessed on what you do? So in other words, what skills are you asking your students to practice, and what knowledge will they gain? So again, we should be explicit about this, and we should be intentional about this. If one of the skills that you are having your students practice through discussions is just their ability to have good written communication, then be upfront about that. Talk about that in terms of their professional lives, how important it is in really any field to be able to write a coherent paragraph and to communicate something concisely, to try to convince somebody of something via written communication. Explain to them why that's a skill that they should want to build Or if you're using discussions because you think it's a good way for them to share each other, work with each other as they're working on a big project, tell them that's why you're doing it. If you're using it to debate the pros and cons of something, tell them that. If you're using it as a way to talk through a real world scenario or problem, make that clear. Like I said, it does not necessarily just have to be course specific knowledge and skills. It can also be some of those, real world soft skills, right? Just the other day, we were in one of our departmental meetings, and somebody from Vanessa, do you remember what the name of the office for like professional development and continuing education for adult learners was called?
No, I don't remember.
That's okay. I can't either. But anyway,
PWCE, that's with Nolan.
Yeah, yes, thank you. But they were saying that, a lot of employers are coming to us and saying, yes, students, either they have those hard skills, those on-the-job skills and knowledge that they need, or that's something that we can teach them on the job site, but what we really need are those soft skills. We need somebody who can write a coherent paragraph, who can talk to a customer, who can lead a meeting. Those are the skills that they're really looking for. So sometimes it might make sense in our classes to kind of spell that out to your students. This is why you should care about this. And then again, avoiding the appearance of busy work. Make sure that if you're going to use discussions, you're doing it in a way that meets the course objectives. And be clear about that. Make sure your students understand that. And that's going to help prevent that feeling of busy work pretty effectively. So guidelines and expectations. What do you want your students to do, and how do you want them to do it? How are they going to be assessed on their discussions? What is going to earn them an A for this assignment, and what's not going to earn them an A? What are your expectations for them? So I think it can be helpful, and this is especially true for kind of lower level courses or introductory courses that you're going to be using discussions. Share some kind of guidelines. And I have a link down here. I can share this PowerPoint with everybody later on. Let me see if I can open it up while I'm sharing. So these are some discussion guidelines that I use in my online classes. It's just a short little document that I usually put in my Start Here module. If I'm using discussions, I tell them, this is what I'm looking for in terms of quality. So I want thoughtful, substantive opinions. I want them to be backed up by facts. I want you to intentionally reference the course texts that we're using and reference, outside sources, something that you have learned yourself, or an article that you've read, or a video that you've watched. If you are going to ask your students to use citations, tell them that, use proper APA citations, make sure you know how to do an in-text citation. I want to see that in your initial posts. This part here is especially, I think, critical, constructive replies to your peers, because again, you don't just want that, oh, I agree with what you said, reply. That's worthless. It's a waste of your time as an instructor, and it's a waste of the student's time as well. So make it clear that you want them to build on the other students' ideas. You want to have them ask questions to generate further discussion. That if they disagree with somebody's opinion or somebody's solution to a problem, that they can question those ideas in a respectful way, that they can share an alternative opinion or make a suggestion, and do that productively and do that respectfully. A couple technical suggestions. So one thing that I usually tell students is it's often a good idea to write out your discussion post in a Word document or in Google Docs or something, rather than just typing it straight into the discussion window. Because I have had students who have spent an hour writing a great discussion post, but they're doing it right into the browser window, and then something happens. They lose their internet connection, Canvas logs them out, their browser freezes, their laptop runs out of batteries, and then it's gone. So I tell them, it's a good idea to do this in a word processor first, have it saved there, and then copy it and paste it into Canvas when you're ready. And then some practical suggestions. If you have your discussion board set up so that they can't see their classmates' posts until they've made their post, make that clear. If you have a certain posting schedule that you want them to follow, let's say you want them to make their initial post by Friday and then have the weekend to reply to their peers, then make that clear ahead of time. So again, I'll share this PowerPoint with you, and it has the link to that document. If you want to use some of that language, you're more than welcome to do so. Highlight really great discussion posts. When I'm teaching an online class that is discussion heavy, something that I like to do is every Monday or Tuesday after the previous week's discussions are over, and as I'm reading through those and starting to grade them, if I see somebody made a really great point, then I'll make an announcement post for the week. And I'll say, great job on last week's discussion, everybody. Vanessa made this great point. And then, copy and paste a little chunk of that student's post so that they can see what a good contribution looks like. It's a way of offering praise to that particular student, and it's a way of giving an example of excellent work to the other students. If you're going to do that, though, be kind of careful about it. Make sure that you're giving praise to a variety of students over time. Even if it's a student that maybe isn't the best writer in the world, if they have some little nugget of insight that I think is worthwhile, I'll still try to point that out. And sometimes that means I'm just going to paraphrase what they say rather than copy and paste the text. If the writing is not super great, I may not want to show that, but I'm still going to feature what they were trying to communicate. Use the first week of class for some formative feedback and some expectation setting. Don't just use it as an introduction. A lot of times I see that where week one discussion post just says, introduce yourself, and it doesn't really say much else. Well, you're kind of losing a week's worth of opportunity for good work there, right? That's not really giving you a lot of useful information about the student, and it's not going to generate much feedback for them. So they're not going to really understand what's expected of them after that first week if all they did was say, hi, my name's Caleb, I live in Spokane. So one thing that I like to do is use that first week's discussion prompt to try to identify some prior knowledge from the students. Ask them what they know about the subject, or ask them to share a story about that subject. I saw an amazing first week discussion prompt from an instructor who was teaching, what was the class? It was about cultural diversity. I don't remember the specific name of the course. But anyway, her first week discussion question was, tell me how your family cooks rice. That was her discussion prompt. And because of the diversity of backgrounds for students, she every year gets amazing responses because every family and every culture prepares rice in a different way. So you'd have students from a Southeast Asian background who would talk about these elaborate production steps that they did to cook rice. Or you'd have some white kids from the suburb who said, well, my family didn't really ever eat rice. I didn't have rice until I was a teenager, and everything in between. So that was a way of getting them to think about, in that context, getting them to think about diversity, getting them to think about how different people's backgrounds, their family, and their culture and their geography affect their experiences and their perceptions. And it was something that they could easily answer because they were speaking from their own background and their own experiences. But it was still worthwhile in the context of the class and in the context of the course's objectives. So in other words, don't just use it for introductions. think about how to use that first week to connect the students to the course content, even if they haven't engaged with the course content yet. So this is critical. How do you construct a good topic and a good discussion question? So discussions need to have goals, structure, and purpose. Again, I have unfortunately seen classes where there is a weekly discussion, but there's not a lot of guidance about it. So students don't really know what's expected of them. They just know that they have to post something, they have to reply to their peers. And that's when you get those really low quality, really low effort discussions where the student's just making something up and then their classmate replies to them and say, oh yeah, that's really interesting, and then they'll move on. So you need to be really clear about why you're doing a discussion, not just in general, but each week you should have a specific goal and a specific purpose. I think usually questions should be open-ended. They should prompt some reflection and some analysis. You know, a good discussion can't just have one right answer. So I wouldn't use a discussion question where there's only one answer, you know, as a math problem or as a historical fact or a scientific or biological fact where there's just one answer. Because then what happens is everybody, if they get the right answer, they just are all saying the same thing. So it should be something that allows for some diversity of responses, either opinions, agree, disagree, personal experience, different solutions to a problem that doesn't have one right answer, some kind of personal reflection. You know, how did this week's topic relate to you? How did you react to that? Do you have an emotional response to this week's content? Some kind of analysis. What do you think the result of this problem is? What did you think the author was trying to convey in this passage? Questions should ideally lead students to construct knowledge, and that means with each other as well, right? So if you're having two students with very different backgrounds both share their experiences of something, then hopefully between those two students they are constructing some new knowledge in between their two experiences, where suddenly they're seeing, oh, I never thought about how somebody in this background or this situation would respond to the same thing in a way that's different from my own response. So anything that can get students to construct knowledge together is really worthwhile. Again, questions should support your learning objectives. So I'm just looking through the chat again here. So Brian, environmental sciences class, obviously the questions should be related to the environmental science topics that you're covering in class and the concepts. So that, again, just like how a first week introduction post isn't really accomplishing very much, you need to make sure that every consecutive week's discussion post is meeting one of those learning objectives or is connected to those learning objectives in some way. I also sometimes find it helpful to provide some guidelines for those replies, especially early in the class. So often what I'll do is in the first 2 or 3, maybe 4 discussion posts, I'm going to have a question or a prompt for your initial post. And then for your replies, I'm going to have some specific suggestions. So for example, look for one of your peers' posts that you disagree with, and then reply to them. Respectfully ask them some questions about why they came to that conclusion. Not necessarily to change their mind or to start a debate, but to understand how they got to that point when you got to a different point. Or look for 2 peers, one that has a similar background as you and one who has a very different background from you, and reply to both of them, or something like that. So give them some specific reply prompts in addition to the initial prompt. And I don't think you need to do that every single discussion post. I think that after a couple of weeks, if students are kind of getting that flow and kind of understanding what you're expecting from them, then you don't need to do that later on in the course. So here are some specific examples of what some of those topics or prompts could look like. So a scenario question is a great one. You pose a scenario. I've seen some great ones in criminal justice where the instructor will post a video, and it might be like a dash cam video from a police officer, or a body cam video, or a bystander's cell phone video. Post that as a scenario, and then ask, how would you respond in this situation? What do you think the participants did right? What do you think they did wrong? What do you think they could have done differently? Or just pose them a written scenario. Here's an environmental problem, a local problem that we've been dealing with for the last 10 years. How would you respond to this situation? Personal questions are also really good. In your own words, how would you define media literacy? Media literacy is a topic that I really like and I've taught in the past. How do you define that? After our readings and after our videos, define media literacy for me in your own words. In your experience, again, how does your family prepare rice? Tell me a story about that. Debate questions. Ask some kind of question that has 2 or more sides to that debate, and have your students take a side, explain their position, and then respond to others. Debate questions take a lot of work on your part because you want to make sure that those are being moderated in a respectful way, make sure that students are operating in good faith. Sometimes you might have to step in on those a little bit, but in the right circumstances with the right debate question, you can get some amazing, amazing student work and some amazing co-creation of knowledge. Current events questions. If something happened in the news recently that is applicable to your topic, an environmental science question, an education question, a allied health question, something relating to physical therapy. If something has happened in the news recently, post about that. Share a news article and then have your students apply their course concept and course knowledge to those events. Have them use the vocabulary that they've been learning about, the mental frameworks that they've been learning about, and have them apply that to that news article. Sharing can also be really good. So don't just use the discussion for discussion. You could also use it to have students share work with each other. So I can give a specific example here from a course that I teach. I teach a learning technologies class online on a pretty regular basis. So one of the assignments for that class is for students to find a technology, a learning technology that they want to learn, and have them dive into that technology. So I break that up into multiple weekly discussions. The first week, I have them go out there, they go out on the internet and look for 5 different technologies that you find interesting, and then share that in the discussion forum, almost like a little annotated bibliography where they're sharing the link to the resource and then briefly describing what each one is. So that's week 1. Week 2, look at everybody else's discussion posts, look at all the technology that they've shared, and then choose one out of all those technologies. Choose one that you want to dive into. That's week 2. Week 3, after you've dived into it a little bit, then I have them create a presentation about their technology, usually as a little screen recording, and have them demonstrate it basically. Do a little 10-minute demonstration of Quizlet, or not Quizlet, that's a cheating, yeah, not Quizlet. Demonstration of Zoom or Poll Everywhere, or one of those cool math games that kids use. Make a little video about it, and then you share it in the discussion topic. So everybody gets to see each other's presentations. It's a way of simulating classroom presentations. And then also have them ask questions of each other or comment on each other's presentations. One that I like that's really simple to implement is just called Tag Your It. So as one of the discussion prompts, first you give them other prompts. about this week's content, but also have them end their discussion post with a question. And then they have to answer 2 or 3 of their peers' questions. So this does 2 things. It forces them to read each other's work because they have to read the question that the other person is asking. And it gives them some guidelines for how to reply to each other, because instead of just saying, oh, I agree, now they're trying to answer each other's questions. That's a really easy one to just kind of tag on to the end of a lot of different discussions. Facilitating and moderating. Here's where we get into like the time commitment that discussions can require of the instructor. I think it's important to note that you don't have to reply to every student every time. That's a mistake that I fell into when I first started doing online discussions. I thought I have to reply to everybody. That's a lot of work. If there's 25 students in the class, that's at least 25 posts that I have to write every week. That's exhausting, and you don't really have to do that. If you are designing those question prompts effectively, and if you've given your students clear guidelines on how they should respond to each other, then you shouldn't have to make that many posts every week. It's important not to make the discussions too instructor focused. So again, if you are replying to everybody, then now suddenly they are spending their time talking back to you and not to each other. So you should reply sometimes, but you shouldn't reply every time. I think it's important to use your writing time to draw out more from your students. If somebody is not quite getting there yet, reply to them and ask some follow-up questions. How might somebody with a different view challenge your opinion? If you think that they are being a little too focused on their own point of view, kind of challenge them on that. Ask them to reflect on how somebody from a different background or in a different situation might disagree with them. That's a way of doing that, rather than just hoping that some other student is going to be brave enough to challenge them. Just have them challenge themselves. Ask them to compare their response to another student's response. Are you two talking about the same thing, just using different words? Do you agree with them, but you're just saying it in a way that feels like you're disagreeing? Or if you do disagree, why? Can you give an example to support your view? So again, if you're asking open-ended questions and you're expecting your students to provide opinions, sometimes you might need to push them to back up that opinion with something. If this is your opinion, back it up with something from this week's readings, from the textbook, from the videos that we watched, or find some other resource that backs up what you're trying to say or supports what you're trying to say. Are there any alternatives to your suggestion? Are there other solutions to the solution you're proposing? Again, getting them to get out of their own head, because I think that's one of the most important aspects of a good discussion, is getting students out of their own brain and getting them to look at other perspectives, other viewpoints, other opinions. In those guidelines that I shared earlier that I put in my course, one of the things I say in there is, if I'm replying to you, it's often because I want you to go a little bit further. I'm asking you questions to expand what you're trying to say. And then in my guidelines, I say, I strongly recommend that you use that opportunity, because that's what it is. I'm not criticizing you, I'm giving you an opportunity to expand on what you said, or to go forward farther, or to look at it from another angle. Just by saying that, I often have gotten much better follow-up responses, where I probably would have graded their initial post pretty poorly, but because they use that opportunity to expand on it a little bit, now I'm going to grade them a lot higher. So again, this does take some time. The way I look at it, I'm kind of front-loading my grading work here, right? I am spending time throughout the week keeping an eye on those posts and occasionally jumping in and asking further questions. And then at the end of the week or the following week when I'm doing my grading, that's actually a lot easier, because I already kind of know the flow that those discussions have taken. So it doesn't necessarily take more time to do it this way. You're just front loading that time rather than waiting till Monday morning to do that work. And then assessment and feedback. Individual written feedback in a discussion is not always necessary. Particularly if you ask one of those follow-up questions, you're already giving them feedback within the discussions when you do that. Also, if you're using a grading rubric, which we'll get to in a second, a good rubric is going to provide them a lot of feedback. So you don't necessarily have to spend a ton of time writing feedback for each individual student. Sometimes it's worth providing some collective feedback in the form of an announcement the following week, or a discussion post of your own, or a little reaction video that you recorded yourself, where you can provide feedback to the whole class. You know, I really like how a lot of people were talking about this, or I wish we had paid a little bit more attention to this. You are providing feedback to everybody all at once, and you don't have to spend as much time writing individualized feedback. This is also true for like more mechanical feedback of make sure that we are following those citation guidelines that I gave you at the beginning of the class. I'm looking for 3 citations in each initial post. I want to make sure you're following APA or MLA or whatever format you prefer. And here's a link to a citation guide that you might want to revisit. Again, sometimes I like to share the really excellent comments that somebody makes, and I'll do that in the post, and I'll say, you know, so-and-so had a great point about this, and I'll copy and paste a little excerpt of that. It's also sometimes really helpful to make connections that students may not make. You might see a broad theme that is coming out of a bunch of students' posts that they may not notice, but if you make those connections and summarize those themes for them, then again, you're helping create that knowledge. You're helping them co-create knowledge by helping them recognize their own connections. And whenever possible, it's really important to provide the grades and the feedback and the rubric scores before the next discussion is due, so that they have time to implement some of that feedback or implement some of those changes based on the grade that they received, based on the rubric score that they got. Sometimes that's not possible. If your workload you just can't get to it, you know, these things happen. But I usually do my best, if at all possible, to get those grades and that feedback done by Monday or Tuesday after the discussions are due, so that they have time to reflect on that and then hopefully make some changes and some improvements in the following week's discussions. So rubrics obviously are going to be a huge help in grading discussions. So this is a rubric that I use in mine. It's pretty simple. I keep it pretty sparse, just 3 criteria. Content, in other words, are they displaying an understanding of the readings? Are they integrating the concepts of this week's module? Are they referring to relevant research or real life applications or real life experiences? Participation. In my case, I wanted them to make their initial post by Friday night, and then I wanted them to spend the weekend replying to each other, at least 2 people. And then again, part of the participation grade is, are you replying in a thoughtful way? Are you stimulating further discussion? Are you asking insightful questions? Are you sharing respectful opposing viewpoints? And then writing quality, you know, I'm not a writing instructor, I don't teach English, but I still want your post to have a certain amount of effort. So, you know, is it free of grammar, spelling, and punctuation errors? Is the writing style clear? Does it facilitate communication? Or, you know, if there's some errors, I'm not going to dock a ton of points as long as I can still understand what you're saying. Whereas if there are so many errors and it's so sloppy that I get confused by what you're saying, then you're going to get a lower score on that criteria. Something else that I think is important is to have a 0 points column for students that just don't post. If your lowest level is 1, then you're going to give them a 30% grade for not doing anything, and that's not acceptable. So I try to make sure that that's in there as well. So if you are going to use a rubric, and I strongly encourage you to use a rubric, reflect on what matters. What do you care about in your discussion posts? What are you looking for? So what are you going to be grading on? Consider participation. If you want them to participate by posting by a certain time or by posting to replying to a certain number of peers, then build that into the rubric. Same with deadlines. If you want them to post by Friday, but the discussion is open until Sunday, then you probably need to build that timing into the rubric so that you can enforce that. And then this is super critical. Weigh your discussions carefully against your other assignments. So I've seen this mistake before where an instructor has, just an example, let's say they have 3 quizzes, 3 papers, and a weekly discussion in a quarter. So that's how many, those are all the activities they have. But what I have seen is 40% of the total grade comes from those 3 exams, and 40% comes from those 3 papers, and 20% comes from, 20% comes from the weekly discussions. Well, if you have 10 weekly discussions worth 20%, then each week's discussion is only worth 2% of their grade. So when the students make that calculation, then they're realizing, oh, I'm putting in more than half my course's effort in these discussions, and I'm only getting a tiny fraction of the total grade for that work. Why am I doing this? So make sure that you're weighing that carefully, especially if you choose to do a weekly discussion. That should probably be a larger portion of the total grade, because that requires a lot of work on the student's part, to write something every week, to reply to their peers every week. If you have like a word count requirement or a certain number of questions that you want them to answer, that's a lot of work. So make sure that you are weighing those correctly.